Good day. Welcome to today's webinar on Interim and Final Research Performance Progress Reports, also known as RPPRs. This event is hosted by the NIH Office of Extramural Research, and my name is Cynthia Dwyer, your moderator for this webinar. Today, we are pleased to bring you experts from the NIH Office of Policy for Extramural Research Administration, also known as ARPA, and Electronic Research Administration, ERA. They are ready to help you gain a better understanding of the types of RPPRs, related policies, recent changes, and what these mean for you, our grantees. Thank you for the questions we received in advance. Those have been incorporated into this presentation. After the webinar is complete, if you still have policy-related questions, feel free to contact us at grantspolicy@od.nih.gov. For technical questions, please utilize our ERA help desk via email at grants.nih.gov/support. These email addresses can also be found on the last slide of the presentation. As noted in the listing for this webinar, the recording will be available on www.youtube.com/NIH grants, and that will be after September 10th. If you have any sound issues during the webinar, please let us know via the chat box in your toolbar. So with logistics out of the way, let's begin with an introduction by our presenters.
Good afternoon. My name is Tony Corio. I'm an Assistant Grants Policy Officer with APRA, or the Office of Policy for Extramural Research Administration.
And hi, my name is Lauren Ruane, and I'm an Assistant Grants Policy Officer with the Office of Policy for Extramural Research Administration. And we also have with us Ms. Scarlett Gibb, Customer Relationship Manager with the NIH Electronic Research Administration, or ERA.
Hi, I'm off camera, but I'm still here.
Okay, this is Tony, and I'd like to pick up with the introduction that Cynthia provided us at the outset. We're going to start today with background on the federal-wide RPPR, NIH's initial implementation of the RPPR, what some of the policy changes are that have come into play this year, and Lauren will take over with the impact on the recipient community, how to access and submit the interim and final RPPRs, and what some of the upcoming changes are in ERA related to this implementation as well. And again, as Cynthia mentioned, we've tried to incorporate some of your questions that we received in advance into the presentation, but we'll also highlight directly some of the questions and answers at the end of the presentation here today as well. Okay, so let's begin with background on the federal-wide RPPR. If you're not already aware, the origins of the RPPR date back to an initiative of the National Science and Technology Council, specifically the Committee on Science's Research Business Models Subcommittee, and the goals were fourfold. Number one, the RPPR is intended to create greater administrative consistency across federal agencies in grant reporting. Secondly, it's intended to provide a consistent reporting format for interim progress reports, and we'll discuss a little bit later how that has kind of evolved a little bit for NIH. Another goal was to decrease burden on recipients by standardizing the reporting format across all federal agencies that award research grants. And finally, to make it easier to compare the outputs and the outcomes of research across government programs. NIH's initial implementation of the RPPR was introduced in October 2012 based on a policy memorandum from the White House Office of Budget and Management and Budget as well as the National Science Technology Council, so very high level federal policymaking entities. The RPPR is intended to replace any previous interim performance reporting formats that were used by NIH and other agencies. Initially, and this is a key point, with NIH's implementation, it was for annual progress reporting. Initially, the NIH piloted the original RPPR with Federal Demonstration Partnership institutions, and in October of 2014, the RPPR became mandatory for all continuation award progress reports on NIH grants. Some recent developments, with that as kind of the backdrop. Last fall in late 2016, in order to keep its promise on implementation of the RPPR, the Research Business Models subgroup expanded its original charge and asked the National Science Foundation and NIH to continue to serve as co-chairs on the work group tasked with incorporating, number one, the lessons learned from agencies during the initial implementation, and number two, to develop a standard format for using in reporting final progress. So I'm not going to necessarily read all of the agencies on here, but as you'll see, there were a dozen federal partners that were part of that work group chaired by NIH and NSF. The work group completed that follow-on task in late 2016, and on November 16th, published a Federal Register notice announcing the updated standardized RPPR to be used for final progress reporting. So essentially with that announcement, it changed NIH's closeout requirements for grant awards. So NIH recipients must submit, must still continue to submit 3 final reports within 120 days of the project period end date, but the final RPPR, effective January of 2017, now replaces the final progress report with the final RPPR to satisfy grant reporting requirements for closeout. In terms of differences between the annual RPPR and the final RPPR, one of the key findings of the interagency work group, or one of the key lessons learned, I should say, is that the recipient community had become more familiar, familiar with the format of the RPPR, so that it would not be advantageous to make substantial changes to that format for final progress reporting. So what you'll see here is largely what the content, the structure and the content of the final RPPR does is it mirrors in many respects the annual RPPR. However, it removes certain questions from the annual RPPR that are not relevant to a final report, such as questions dealing with expected changes in the upcoming budget period. However, one new section was added to the RPPR, that is Section I for the final RPPR related to project outcomes. Additionally, there are some program-specific requirements for small business innovation research grants that are required through programmatic regulation. So those have been integrated into Section E of the final RPPR for SBIR and STTR grants only. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about one of the new requirements introduced this year, specifically for final RPPRs, and that is the project outcomes. It is essentially a section that only involves one question or one field, and it's an important key point to bear in mind here is that it's designed to be made publicly available by the agency. It's kind of analogous in some respects to the public impact portion of the abstract at the application stage. It's sort of a post-award end-of-project version of that. Within the Federal Register announcement, federal-wide, the reporting in the outcomes section is limited to a maximum of 8,000 characters. As you'll hear later in the presentation, though, we're hoping to strongly encourage, is a much more succinct summary for NIH grants. The outcomes, again, should be concise and written with a lay audience in mind rather than an audience of scientists. In an effort to increase transparency, we do want to make you aware that NIH will make the outcomes data that is reported in Section I of the final RPPR available in Reporter. We have not done that yet to date, but we do expect to do that in the upcoming fiscal year. What are some of the key policy changes that this entails? One important point to keep in mind, and that is specific to NIH grants, is not just what's new and what has been introduced, such as the project outcomes field, but what's going away. You may be aware that under previous NIH policy, specifically that outlined under the Administrative Requirements section of the NIH grants policy statement, that if a competitive renewal or Type 2 application have been submitted, whether funded or not, the progress report contained in that application may serve in lieu of a separate final progress report. That policy has certain limitations and challenges to it as it related to now implementation of a final RPPR. First, going back to the Fed-wide origins of the RPPR, as I mentioned at the outset, the RPPR format now is prescribed for all performance reporting based on that overarching federal policy. So if we maintained that particular NIH-specific policy pertaining to Type 2s, our performance reporting requirement would be misaligned with the requirements of other federal research agencies. But also importantly, and perhaps more importantly, we would be missing an opportunity for structured data collection on the last year of a competitive segment of award without changing it, changing to a final RPPR. Okay, so we announced effective February 9th that NIH requires that organizations submit an interim RPPR while the renewal application or Type 2 is under consideration. So in the event that a Type 2 is funded, NIH will treat the interim RPPR as the annual performance report for the final year of the previous competitive segment. If the final disposition of the Type 2, though, is that that competitive renewal application is not funded, then NIH will treat the interim RPPR as the institution's final RPPR. As with the final RPPR, project outcomes is a required field for the interim RPPR. In making this change in policy, though, we did want to reduce as much of the burden on recipients as we could. So hence why we are then considering that we are treating the interim RPPR as a final RPPR if the Type 2 is not funded, and we're not going to require an additional report for a final. So what does the workflow process look like? Scenario one would be a case where a project is coming to an end and there's no associated competitive renewal application with it. The recipient in that case would submit a final RPPR no later than 120 calendar days from the period of performance end date. That's the end date or due date required for all grant closeout related reports. Scenario two, though, would be a case where a Type 2 competitive renewal has been submitted. In that case, the recipient would need to submit an interim RPPR no later than 120 calendar days from the period of performance end date. If the competing renewal is funded, NIH will treat that RPPR as the annual report, performance report for the final year of the competitive segment. You may ask why that particular time frame. Part of the rationale on the due date for that is that unlike the annual RPPRs, which are due before the end of the current budget year, with the implementation of the interim RPPR, we wanted to allow the recipient community, particularly investigators, to concentrate initially on their renewal applications. And then additionally, by having the deadline for the interim RPPR at a point that's in time that's after the end of the current competitive segment, we'd have more complete data for that, or more current and complete data for the end of that particular initial competitive segment. Scenario 3 is much like that in scenario 2, the only difference being that if the competing renewal is not funded, again, NIH will treat the interim RPPR as the institution's final report. One thing that I would want to note, additional point that we want to note here, is that the outcomes, the project outcomes section, or section I, is required in every one of these scenarios, and it is a mandatory field in ERA Commons. So if it is not completed, the submission will not go, of the report will not go through. And again, the standard compliance requirements contained within the NIH grants policy statement for grant reporting requirements also apply now to this new interim and final RPPRs. We did have a different rollout of the interim and final RPPRs for SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research Grants, and Small Business Technology Transfer Grants. We did not initially implement the RPPR, the final RPPR for those grants in January. Rather, implementation was effective June 30th of 2017 for all SBIR, STTR Phase 2 final reports. The renewal policy regarding Type 2 applications that was discontinued in February for other awards is now discontinued for SBIR, STTR awards as well. So for Phase 1 or Phase 2 SBIR grants and cooperative agreements, this means that an interim RPPR is required if an application for a Phase 2 or Phase 2B grant has been submitted. In the event that that Type 2 associated with the Phase 2 or 2B application is funded, much like with all the other grants, we'll treat the interim as the annual performance report for the final year of that phase on the previous competitive segment. And if the Type 2 is not funded, the interim RPPR will be treated by NIH staff as the institution's final RPPR. The workflow process for and scenarios for SBIR and STTR awards is much the same as it is for other grants. I would only add that there is an additional layer there for SBIR type 2s going from not just Phase 1 to Phase 2, but also potentially from Phase 2 to Phase 2B applications and awards as well. Now, I mentioned that most of the content remained the same except for the final RPPR compared with the annual RPPR, except for the removal of some questions. Some additional questions were added for SBIR and STTR awards only, specifically 2 questions in Section E and 3 questions in Section G, all pertaining to describe sales revenue, describing the regulator approval, status of clinical trials for your product, description of company outcomes and reimbursement approval status. Hopefully these should not look new, though, to SBIR or STTR recipients, though. These were data points that were contained and requested in the old final progress report instructions for SBIR Phase 2 awards. So the content requirements are now just incorporated within those two sections of the final, interim and final RPPRs for SBIR and STTR. The content hasn't changed. It's just that they are now being, those particular questions are being requested in a structured data manner. Okay, so kind of quick summary then of where we are now after this latest round of implementation with the RPPR. As of February 9th now, there are 3 types of RPPRs, each of which is outlined in the NIH RPPR instruction guide. I do want to make a point to emphasize that there is a single guide for all varieties of the RPPR. There are not distinct or separate ones for each one. So we have the annual RPPR, which is the one that hopefully everyone is familiar with, which is used to describe a grant scientific progress, to identify significant changes, report on personnel, and describe plans for subsequent budget period or year. Then I'll skip down to the final RPPR, which is used as part of the grant closeout process to submit project outcomes in addition to the information on the RPPR, except for budget and plans for the upcoming year. And now we have kind of this hybrid, so to speak, of termed an interim RPPR, which is specific to situations where there is a Type 2 renewal application. And if the Type 2 is not funded, that interim RPPR will serve as the final report for the project. If the Type 2 is funded, that interim RPPR will serve as kind of a de facto annual report for the final year of the previous competitive segment. It's important to keep in mind as well that the data elements collected on the interim RPPR are the same as for the final RPPR, including project outcomes. Okay, with that background, I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague, Lauren, who will discuss the impact on the recipient community.
Thank you, Tony. Now we're going to cover how these changes impact the recipient community. With NIH's implementation of the final and interim RPPR, recipients will need to adhere to the new requirement to report on project outcomes, which, as stated earlier, will be made publicly available, thus allowing recipients the opportunity to provide the general public with a concise summary of the cumulative outcomes of the project. So failure to report on project outcomes may result in remedies for noncompliance, which may result in enforcement actions by the IC. So if the recipient organization fails to adhere to this new requirement, the IC may wish to withhold future awards until compliance is achieved. When drafting the outcome statement, recipients should ensure that project outcomes are written in a concise lay language which can be understandable to the general public. And once submitted for review to the NIH, the accuracy and completeness of all elements, including project outcomes of the interim and final RPPR, is the responsibility of the assigned program officer. However, if the report is not satisfactory and additional materials are needed to make the final RPPR acceptable, requests for additional materials, clarifying information, or revised project outcomes will be made by the program officer using the final report additional materials or FRAM feature. Here's a screenshot of the FRAM module, which allows recipients to upload information in response to NIH requests. I wanted to highlight a useful resource for the recipient community, which are the RPPR FAQs. NIH staff have received a number of inquiries from recipients regarding the implementation of the final and interim RPPR, and we've posted those questions on the public RPPR FAQ page. On this slide, we've included a sampling of the frequently asked questions that might be useful to recipients. We've added some guidance here on how to answer individual elements of the final or interim RPPR. For example, how to fill out question D1 under the participants section has been a popular one in the grants policy inbox, so we've added that question to the public FAQs as a reference. Here are some more examples of some questions that might be helpful to you, the recipients. The second question here is useful because it provides the recipient community with a screenshot of the Outcomes tab in the RPPR module, which allows recipients to view instructions on how to fill out the project outcome statement prior to initiating the final or interim RPPR. Here's a screenshot of the Outcomes tab in the RPPR module. As you can see, we've alerted you, the recipient, that the outcome statement will be publicly available by bolding the text. In addition, we've emphasized the NIH instruction that the length of the outcome statement should not exceed half a page, even though you are allowed to enter up to 8,000 characters or 3 pages worth of text. Lastly, we've included a link to an example of an acceptable project outcome statement that recipients should find helpful as well. This information can also be found in the RPPR instruction guide. Now we're going to briefly cover how recipients can access and submit the interim and final RPPR. So both the interim and final RPPR are currently identical in process and information required. The difference between the two is when and where they are made available to initiate and submit. The interim RPPR link will be made available to the signing official in the status screen when a grant is eligible for submission of a competing renewal application. The final RPPR is only available as part of the closeout process, and the process final RPPR link only appears on the closeout status screen. So who can submit the interim and final RPPR? Currently, the interim and final RPPR can be submitted by the principal investigator and the signing official. And delegating authority to other users is under consideration by the NIH. And we just wanted you to know that when NIH implemented the final and interim RPPR, the intent was to have the delegations remain the same as the final progress report. However, the NIH has heard the feedback from the community and is considering delegating authority to other users. The NIH will update the recipient community when and if there are any changes. Now we're going to discuss some upcoming ERA changes. NIH implementation for program official approval for the interim RPPR is underway and will be implemented in 3 phases. Phase 1, which has already been implemented, provides the program officer with the ability to approve an interim RPPR in the program management module. For the interim RPPR, NIH requests for clarifying information or additional materials will temporarily need to be requested by the program officer and submitted by the recipient via email. So like the final RPPR has the FRAM module, the interim RPPR will have its own request for additional material functionality, which is currently under development. Phase 2, which has also been implemented, allows NIH approval status to be maintained when an interim RPPR goes into closeout and is converted into a final RPPR. And that status may be seen in the Grants Closeout tab. So as we stated earlier in the presentation, when a recipient submits a competing renewal application that is ultimately not funded, the NIH will treat the interim RPPR as the institution's final RPPR. So when the program officer reviews and approves the interim RPPR, that approval will be carried over when the interim RPPR is converted to a final. Phase 3 includes the request for additional material functionality for the interim RPPR to be fully automated. Therefore, project officers will eventually have the ability to make requests, and recipients will be able to submit additional materials for the interim RPPR in mid-September via the ERA Commons. However, until the additional material functionality is implemented, requests and responses for clarifying information or additional materials, again, will be made by email. In the event that project outcomes are not acceptable, requests for revised project outcomes for final and interim RPPRs will be made by the program official and submitted by the recipient using the applicable additional material functionality. And as I mentioned before, for the final RPPR, we have FRAM, and for interim RPPR, we will have an additional material functionality, and that development and implementation is planned for mid-September. And both modules will be enhanced in order to capture revised project outcomes in a format that could be reported out to the public. And just to note, at this time, the project outcomes that are being submitted and approved are currently not being published in Reporter. NIH has decided to only post the outcomes once all of the ERA functionality described in this presentation are in place and the process of receiving revised project outcomes becomes a more efficient process. In addition, we wanted to ensure that the recipient community had an opportunity to absorb all of the additional guidance that has been put out there in terms of how to correctly write the project outcome statement. A guide notice will be issued announcing the effective date as to when the project outcomes will be made public. I just wanted to share with you a screenshot of what the enhanced FRAM module would look like that I mentioned in the previous slide. And note the module for the interim RPPR, once it's implemented, will look similar to this, if not the same. And as with FRAM, recipients will still have the capability to upload responses in a PDF format, but the revised project outcome statement, if requested by the NIH, will need to be entered into a text box to ensure that the response is in a format that could be reported out to the public. So now we just wanted to have a little fun and test your knowledge of the NIH's implementation of the interim and final RPPR by having you answer a series of questions that we've developed for you. So first question, which report is due when the project period has ended and a competing renewal application has not been submitted? You would just indicate your answer by selecting the corresponding letter on your keyboard. That's correct. You all got it, the final RPPR. Next question. Which report is due when the project has ended and a competing renewal application has been submitted? The answer is B, interim RPPR. All right, which section of the interim or final RPPR will be made publicly available and provide cumulative findings of the project? Okay, the answer is outcomes. Good job, you guys. Know your stuff. Okay, true or false? NIH will continue to accept the final progress report for SBIR STTRs. And the correct answer is false, because effective June 30th, the NIH will now accept final RPPRs for SBIR STTR grants. Okay, well, thank you for playing along with us. And we do have a couple of resources for you. We have the RPPR instruction guide, which is a great resource. It gives you instructions on how to fill out each element of the, all three of the progress reports. In addition, we've recently updated the RPPR instruction guide to include section I, the outcome section. Also, the ERA online help website is a great resource because it includes information on how to initiate and submit the final and interim RPPR, and it even includes screenshots, which should be helpful to the recipient community. And lastly, like we covered earlier, the RPPR FAQs are another great resource that is hopefully helpful to you all. Okay, we're now going to cover some questions that were sent in advance to our Opera All mailbox, so I'll hand it off to Scarlett.
Hi, everyone. We'd like to start this portion of the webinar by thanking many of you out there who took the time to submit questions to us in advance to help us identify where there is confusion and where we can offer some clarification to make the implementation process more seamless. In addition to questions related to the current changes, we also received some suggestions pertaining to the RPPR overall that go beyond impacting just the interim and final RPPRs. Please know that the RPPR team will take those suggestions into consideration for future enhancements, resources allowing, after discussing internally with NIH grants management and program official users. So one feature of the interim and final RPPRs for which we received a lot of questions and comments is the internal institutional delegations, which is a functionality in Commons. For instance, a number of people asked, why can only the PI or SO initiate, prepare, and submit the final RPPR? This is different from the regular RPPR, which can be initiated by the grant administrator with delegate access, or at least initiated by the PI and then routed to a grant administrator. Similarly, some pointed out for final RPPRs, the PI is not going to their signing official to submit the report. Is there any way to make it so that the report has to be submitted by the signing official? Similar to the regular RPPR. Reports are being submitted with errors because they are not being checked for compliance by the signing official. Others noted perhaps the interim and final RPPRs could be configured so that only the PI role may push forward the submission, but the assistant role can help populate the information, similar to the current annual RPPR. When NIH implemented the final and interim RPPR, the intent was to keep the general process the same as that for the final progress report. But we have heard the feedback from the community, like the comments just mentioned, that the internal institutional delegation functionality for the interim and the final RPPR should be reassessed. We are considering delegating authority to other users modeled on the within institution delegations available for the annual RPPR, to make these available for all varieties of the RPPR. We are examining resources and do not have a specific rollout date yet, but we do anticipate modifications in this area. NIH will update the recipient community if and when changes to this feature can be implemented. We also received others interim and final RPPR specific questions, which we'll go through now. Question: Is there any reason you can't make the interim and final RPPR also appear in the RPPR tab, instead of only making it accessible via the status tab, or as in the case of the final, the closeout tab? The answer is the RPPR tab was systematically designed for annual RPPRs with one document to one grant number, which makes adding the IRPPR or the final RPPR to this tab not possible in the current structure. This is also the reason the multi-year funded, the MYRPPR, is not available in this tab at this time. NIH has heard the feedback, and this suggestion will be prioritized based on resources. Is there any, is there any way the final RPPR, when it is routed to the signing official for submission, appear in the RPPR tab? Right now, it is hard to go to the specific grant and locate the correct RPPR to be submitted. It would be easier if it would appear in the RPPR list. Again, the same reasoning above exists, but another reason also exists. The final RPPR is available as part of the closeout process. The final RPPR link only appears in the closeout screen as part of the closeout process. For more information on how to submit your final RPPR, please refer to the ERA online help mount. Question. Can you please show us how a PI or SO initiates the final RPPR in the comments? Our understanding is this is done through the status and closeout menu. Response. The final RPPR is only available as part of the closeout process, and the final RPPR link only appears in the closeout screen. For more information on how to submit your final RPPR, please refer to the ERA online help module. And Lauren covered this in slide 28. Slides will be available after the webinar. Question. If a final RPPR is initiated in a closeout module, and prior to submission of the final RPPR, a renewal application is submitted, will the contents of the RPPR be transferred to the interim report? Or would any content of the report entered in the final RPPR need to be re-entered when the RPPR appears as an interim RPPR? Good question, and good news. The content of the final RPPR will transfer to the interim RPPR when the grant is removed from the closeout process, after the renewal grant has been submitted. No need to re-enter. Question. The searchable database of pending progress reports due in the next 4 months does not seem to contain interim or final RPPRs. Will those be added so all progress reports are searchable in one lookup location? Answer. We are not able to calculate the due dates for either the final or the interim RPPR 4 months ahead of time, as we are with the regular RPPRs. It all depends on whether the grant will be extended or a competing renewal is submitted. We could look into resources needed for creating a report for grants whose project's end date will be 4 months into the future at the time the report is run, and create that as a similar report. So that's it for the questions that I have. I'm going to hand this off to Lauren to answer more policy-related questions.
Thank you, Scarlett. So we did have a question that asked, when grad students, postdocs work a partial year and then leave, and they work more than 1 calendar month, how do you report these individuals on the participant list if they don't have a Commons ID? Well, if you refer to the RPPR instruction guide, it explains that a Commons ID is required for all individuals with a postdoctoral, graduate, or undergraduate role. This requirement was implemented back in October of 2013 2013. Therefore, it's the institution's responsibility to have those commons IDs created for reporting. Unfortunately, RPPR is lacking an ERA Commons ID for graduate and undergraduate students will receive an error, and the RPPR will not be accepted by the NIH without this information. So in order to submit an acceptable RPPR, the institution will have to obtain the Commons ID for the individual. Question. Initially, the Participants tab wasn't going to be part of the final RPPR. PIs have almost no idea how to complete this and can't ensure accuracy of effort on behalf of the institution. So regarding filling out section D1, which is the participant section of the interim or final RPPR, guidance has been published on the NIH's public FAQ website. For this section, the recipient should only report on the individuals or staff that worked on the project during the last budget period, minus any approved no-cost extensions. Question. What is the expectation for the content in section B4, which I believe refers to training opportunities for postdocs and grad students? But like any other element in the final annual or interim RPPR, the contents of any section should be written in accordance with the instructions outlined in the RPPR instruction guide. Question. Why does the RPPR allow you to submit with a participant list that includes all individuals listed with 0 calendar months effort? You are able to submit a full list of individuals with 0 calendar months, which often is happening on the final RPPRs. So again, based on the information contained in the RPPR guide, recipients are instructed to round to the nearest whole person month. Therefore, if the PD or PI worked 0.1 to 0.4 person months, then you would round down to 0. So with this, it is possible if all personnel worked 0.1 to 0.4 months on a project that the participant list can be submitted with all zeros. However, if you suspect that the individuals are just putting zeros because they are not sure how to fill out this section on the final or interim RPPR, again, guidance has been published on the NIH's public FAQs website. And for this section, the recipient should only report the individuals or staff that worked on the project during the last budget period, minus any approved no-cost extensions. So thank you for all your questions. In closing, we'd like to reiterate that we also received several comments with suggestions for enhancements that would apply to the annual RPPR as well, not just the interim and finals. We're not going to go through those here today, but we do want to acknowledge that constructive feedback was received on issues including, but not limited to, creating functionality into RPPR to allow direct access to the RPPR for other investigators or delegates on the grant, the signing officials functionality pertaining to Section C of the RPPR, which is the publication section, and unobligated balance questions, and significant rebudgeting justifications for annual RPPRs. But again, we want to thank you for the time for submitting those suggestions and questions in advance to us. We appreciate that.
Thank you to our presenters today. The NIH Office of Extramural Research would like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules as well to join us. Within 24 hours, you will receive a follow-up email with contact information for further questions and how to access the PowerPoint as well as the recording. We want to wish you a very good day. This concludes today's webinar.